Hey Raghunath, tell everyone about our Patreon community.
Sure, Kaustubha. The Wisdom of the Sages Patreon community is an incredible online yoga resource. If you like the type of yoga wisdom and culture we share on the show, then our Patreon community is a great next step. This is a listener-supported podcast, and any level of sponsorship will unlock a wide range of live and archived classes, talks, and even workshops.
Raghunath teaches, I teach, and we have a host of other excellent teachers on topics ranging from yoga philosophy, asana classes, storytelling, Ayurveda, kirtan, cooking, meditation, and a lot more.
We even have an incredible online Bhakti 12-step recovery group.
So if you want to check it out, go to patreon.com/wisdom of the sages.
All right, let's get it on.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Live from New York City, this is Wisdom of the Sages, your daily yoga podcast. Today I'm your host, Kaustubha. Our regular host, or co-host, Raghunath, is taking a day off. He needs it. You know, he's got to rest a little bit, right, Mary?
That's right. I think he's getting better.
He's getting better every day, so this is not a cause of concern. But it's it's one thing is that because today's the interview day, we find that sometimes it's easier if one person interviews someone than two people, because it's like two people like pulling the interviewee in different directions. So we were already have been considering to some extent practicing that, where we just had one person do the interview day. But also it's good for Raghunath to slow down a little bit and take a day off and recuperate as he's regaining his strength. But he's doing good. He's looking good. So that's good news. We have our special guest today, Simon Haas, who's a brilliant author. But before we bring Simon on, Mary, are there any special announcements that you could make for us today for our audience?
We have Bhakti Recovery Group meeting today at 9:30 a.m.
Bhakti Recovery Group.
And
I've been informed that there's a Bhakti Recovery website, actually, that people can go to, too. We didn't mention that yesterday, but there's a Bhakti Recovery website. I think it's bhaktirecovery@gmail.com. Please, someone online, correct me if that's incorrect. Okay, and?
Kali, Colombia, January 12th through 21st.
That's always there, Kali, Colombia.
Yeah. And there's Nityananda Chandra's reminding me that the Gita Shloka group study is at 9 a.m. also today, right after the show.
Oh, wonderful. And they're doing the 7th chapter now, right? Yeah.
And then this whole week, we're keeping the show at 8 a.m., right?
I think we should keep the show at 8 a.m. Yeah, we'll do that as Raghunath's getting better. I think it's just a little bit easier if we keep it at 8 a.m. And whether we do it in the long run or whether we choose to go back to 5, we're not sure yet, People can send in what they think, Maybe we should do a survey on Patreon and figure out what's best for people.
That's a good idea.
Okay. So now let's welcome our guest, Simon Haas. Actually, we mentioned Kali, Colombia. I met Simon in Kali, Colombia. It was in August. I think in early August. I just by chance, I happened to need some dental work at that time, and I went down to Kali, and at that time, Simon was there doing a retreat. And he was someone that I always wanted to meet, and somehow fate brought us together. It was a great joy to meet you, Simon. Welcome to Wisdom of the Sages.
Well, thank you so much, Kaustubha Prabhu. It's such an honor to be here, and I likewise had heard so much about you. So it was a real surprise and pleasure to get to meet you in Kali.
Yeah, it really was. And not only did I get to meet you, but I got to hear quite a bit of the presentations that you're giving, which I really enjoyed, and which has also led me to finally reading your books. Over the course of some years, I've heard just such praises of your books, and I'm always running around, and there's so many books to read, but I'm glad I've taken the time now to dive into your books and explore them. Simon is an author. He's written 2 really fantastic books. These are books that are based on the teachings of Bhagavatam. They're drawing out of Bhagavatam, they're drawing out of Bhagavad Gita and the Bhakti tradition, but they're expressed in ways that are very readable, very easy to understand. If someone's new to this, these books speak in a language that they can understand very clearly. I recommend his books if you want to, let's say, share something with someone that has no familiarity with Bhakti Yoga. These are great books. One of the books is called Yoga and the Dark Night of the Soul. And the book that we're going to discuss today is called the Book of Dharma. But Simon, I could read a whole bio, but maybe just to get started, maybe you could just share a little bit about your life. You've led a very interesting life, and I think it's always helpful to get a little background on the author before we go into the books.
I was born in a family that with a strong interest in the teachings of ancient India. So from a young age, I began reading the Mahabharata, the Ramayana.
At what age?
Well, my father joined the International Society for Krishna Consciousness just around the time I was born in 1975, and had the chance to meet Srila Prabhupada. So right from early childhood, I had the great opportunity of being exposed to these incredible texts. Mm-hmm. Having said that, growing up, initially I didn't take such an interest in it. It was a little bit later in my life as a teenager when I started becoming interested in archaeology. That led to like a deep interest in the texts of India. So I had read about an archaeologist named Schliemann. I don't know if your viewers have heard of him.
Say that again. What's the name?
Schliemann.
Okay.
He had read the classics of ancient Greece, and he wondered whether these particular narratives had any like historical truth to them. At that time, they were considered to be just stories.
Okay.
So he traveled with a party of archaeologists. They went to what's currently Turkey, and they discovered the foundations of Troy. And apparently, they also discovered the grave of Agamemnon and so on.
Okay.
And I read that, and I thought, well, how about some of these places that are mentioned in the Bhagavad Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Mahabharata? Maybe I could be part of the team that explores the island city of Dwarka off the coast of India. And so I began studying the texts of India with a lot of interest.
From a different perspective than you did as a child.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And began studying Sanskrit. And over time, my interest shifted. So instead of being interested in unearthing artifacts from the ground or the bottom of the sea, I began to see the treasures that are in these ancient texts, something far more valuable than just ordinary artifacts in the ground.
Right.
So these texts speak, for example, of a wisdom that can help us overcome suffering associated with time. So fear, lamentation, and confusion. Fear is misery associated with the future. Lamentation is suffering associated with the past, and confusion with the present. Mm-hmm. So what a promise these ancient texts hold. And I then began to take a strong interest in them.
I think in your book, in the book, I'll hold it up here for those that are able to see the Book of Dharma. But in this book, you mentioned that there was a certain point where you were approaching, let's say, these ancient texts or this tradition for knowledge, but like for information, let's say. But at a certain point, you shifted and understood, actually, these are for self-transformation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one very interesting thing about the text of ancient India is that they're not self-help books. So that's obviously a genre that's a recent it's a recent genre from our contemporary Western world.
Okay.
So as I began looking through the texts of India, I reached like a limit to how deeply I could enter into them. For one thing, they're in Sanskrit, they're in codified form. There's a whole universe of meaning within each shloka or verse or within each line. And it became quite clear that I needed to find a teacher. I needed to study within a tradition. And it also became clear that these texts are aiming not at information, but at transformation.
And so that led you to Vrindavan and your studies there and your kind of like, say, connection living among the monks there?
That's right. It's actually the first time I met Raghunath.
Oh, okay. In Vrindavan.
I met him in Vrindavan briefly in, I think it was 1991, early 90s. And
Okay.
He's the first famous person I've ever met.
Okay.
I was a young boy at that time. And
How old were you then, roughly around?
Maybe 16 years old.
Okay. Yeah, so he wasn't much older than you. Maybe he was 20 then or so, 21.
He came for a short visit for
Yeah.
short period of time.
Okay. So then when you went there when you were 16 or a little earlier than that?
The first time I traveled to India was when I was 13, and then again later
Okay.
when I was 16. And then I began to spend longer periods studying
Okay.
there.
Great. And so that gave you a chance to live a monastic life in what we could say, I mean, certainly one of, or you could argue the like most important like hub of bhakti yoga in the world.
Right.
And obviously to meet a lot of influential people and an opportunity to study and to immerse yourself in that culture. And then from there, you went on to university. You're currently still doing a PhD, correct?
I am, yeah, at the moment.
And that's at Oxford University, or?
At the University of Oxford.
And you've also studied at Cambridge University. Yes?
I'm actually not able to go to Oxford at the moment because Costa
COVID
Rica, where I'm
restrictions.
living, has been designated a red country.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
So I'll have to wait a
be
few
careful.
months.
Okay, great. So you've led a very interesting life, as a young man, being in this holy place, living among the monks, with from a very early interest in these texts. Something drew you to write this book, the Book of Dharma. Could you share what led to that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One of them is that I noticed that the texts of India are quite challenging in some ways. So the vocabulary that's used, there are many Sanskrit terms, they're quite specialized terms.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit of a cultural, I would say, a cultural leap that readers or audiences in the contemporary West need to make to enter into those teachings of ancient India. So
Mm-hmm.
in discussing some of these teachings with friends from university, I wanted to I began trying to explain them in a way that was very accessible. My personal interest in particular is how these teachings apply to the challenges that we face in everyday life. So rather than being on the level of ideas, which is also important, but they can actually be applied in a way where we're actually living them in our life.
Right,
So that's something I have a personal interest in my own journey as well.
Well, it is, and you define this early in your book that this is being drawn from texts that they were part of what they were meant to do was they're instructive to kings and queens, to rulers, and certainly we see that playing out, like say in the Srimad Bhagavatam, where it's like it's sages, but it's also especially about the kings and kind of how the knowledge is going back and forth between, or especially from the sages to the kings. One might look at that and say, well, I'm not a king, I'm not a queen. And these are very old, ancient texts. So could you share for us a bit what makes these books relevant today, how they become relevant?
I love what you mentioned about this being a knowledge for kings and queens.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that throughout many texts. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, there's the famous verse, Raja Vidya Raja Guyam. So we often translate that as Raja Vidya, the king of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Our acharyas or commentators in our tradition, they translate that in both ways. Sometimes the king of knowledge, and at other times they also translate it as a knowledge for kings.
I see. And the secrets for the kings, Raja
And see,
Guhyam.
that's right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. So this is it's a guarded knowledge, and a knowledge that was originally intended for decision makers. So in our life, if we make a decision, it'll affect those immediately around us, our family members, colleagues, friends. If a queen or a king makes a decision, it'll affect an entire kingdom, maybe thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. It'll be the difference. It could be the difference between an entire nation going to war or prospering. So the rishis or sages of India, they understood that the quality of decision making of a monarch is paramount, and they developed these teachings that are essentially for these decision makers. But having said that, we are also in many ways like queens and kings. We have a kingdom, and that kingdom is our life, our perceptual world. Our perceptual world will never be better than the design principles we use to create it.
Well, that's interesting because you speak early on in your book, you mentioned 3 laws of perception, which I found very interesting. And let me know if I got them right, if I understood them correctly. But the first law has to do with the way that we see the world is shaped by ourself. Like we're all perceiving it differently. And the second one had to do with what we fixate through our perception affects us or changes us.
Right.
And then the third law of perception is that by changing our perception, we change our world. And I assume you mean by that, like we change our own inner world as well as we become an instrument in terms of the external world. Did I get it right there?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And in relation to the Dharma Code, the way that the rishis explain that is just in that way, that when we embody these principles of Dharma within our own being, that then manifests in our kingdom. So there's an inner work that we focus on, which then manifests in the kingdom, or how to put it, the arena of everyday life.
Which may be our family, maybe our workplace, or however far our influence extends.
That's one thing I love about the Dharma Code, that it can be applied to any field. So we can apply these principles to these ancient principles, universal principles to our business, and we'll see the effects of that.
Okay. I'm sorry, please continue.
We can apply it to our relationships, and when we focus on embodying these principles, it has an effect in all areas of our life.
Okay, so you've mentioned a Dharma Code. Let's get into that. Through these texts, you've extracted and presented for your readers a code. Maybe just briefly, you can discuss really what do you mean by the word, what does the word Dharma convey here, and what is the Dharma Code?
The Sanskrit word Dharma has different meanings depending on context. So when we see that word in the Sanskrit verses from the texts of India, it can mean slightly different things. So sometimes dharma can mean one's nature or purpose, as in swadharma. Here, dharma means, in particular, it means when the quality of our thoughts, our words, and our actions are such that the universe supports us in our efforts. So the word dharma comes from the verbal root dri, which in Sanskrit means to support or to sustain. So often when I explain this, I tell people about the Wright brothers, who in 1903 they created the first flying machine. So it took the Wright brothers many different, they designed many different shapes of wings, hundreds actually, before they had just the right shape of wing. And with the right shape, something incredible happens. A contraption that's so heavy that even several people can't lift it, with the right shape of wing, it rises into the sky, carrying a passenger.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way, with the right principles of design in our life, then something remarkable happens. We live in accord with what we might call the hidden laws of life, and the universe sustains us in our efforts.
Okay, so in other words, here, Dharma, the implication of the word Dharma here is that there's a sense of personal integrity, how we live our life, that is aligned with some universal laws.
Right.
And then when we connect with that, what happens to our life? Why do we want to do that?
Right. Well, what happens when we there are certain, and when we'll come to this, there are certain principles of Dharma, and when we embody them in our person, then Dharma manifests in our life. And the result of that is that we begin to awaken our full potential. So we become what a king or a queen should be. So we're able to make powerful decisions in our life that are aligned with who we are as a person, and that yield the best possible outcomes in our life and in the life of those around us.
So, okay, wonderful. So then what is the Dharma Code?
So these teachings come from the Srimad Bhagavatam, and they're also explained in many other texts, such as the Mahabharata. Even some of these principles are discussed in the Upanishads. So in Canto, the first book of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and the 17th chapter, there's a section that describes the 4 principles that make up the Dharma Code. And these are truth, purity, non-violence, and discipline. Non-violence is sometimes described using different words. So sometimes ahimsa, sometimes also daya, which is compassion, which is even a higher, actually it's a higher principle.
Fuller manifestation of nonviolence.
That's right. Yeah. And these 4 principles, when they are lived together, then Dharma awakens in our life. Now, of course, these 4 principles, truth, purity, nonviolence, and discipline, they start off for us as just being words. And so I like to describe them as sutras. So the word sutra in Sanskrit means tip of a thread. Now, if we take a modern analogy, then we can think of like Scotch tape. In England, we say sellotape. I think in the US, you say Scotch tape.
I think Scotch is the brand, but it's so prevalent that we just call it Scotch tape.
So if you have some tape like this, we've all had the experience where you're trying to find the end of it, and you put it to the light.
It can be frustrating.
You run your fingernail around it, looking for the beginning of it. But once you have the beginning, then you can unravel it, and you can use it for whatever it is you want. So in the ancient world, they didn't have plastics, so they use the analogy of a spool of thread. If you can locate the tip of the thread, the sutra, you can unravel it, and the thread may extend for many hundreds of yards. So truth, purity, nonviolence, and discipline are like the tip of the thread. And the rishis have given us some indication of what truth is, some indication of what nonviolence or discipline are. And then it's for us within our own life to begin unraveling that and seeing where it leads us in our own practice, in our own life.
Yeah, well, I would imagine like most of us, most people in general probably think like, yeah, well, I try to be truthful and pure, and I try not to hurt anyone, and maybe I need a little more discipline in my life or something like that. But as I was reading your book, I was seeing how it seems to be you're providing thoughts to encourage us to go very deep into these concepts, to like maybe we could look at them one at a time. But let's take truth, satya in Sanskrit. Let's take truth. You told a story there that I thought was very interesting about when you were asked to pluck some tulsi leaves. Could you share that? Because I just thought, I mean, it was very truthful of you to share it. Because in one sense you're going within and looking at what was within you that maybe wasn't something that needed to be changed. But I thought it was so illustrative and something that made me think about my own life.
Right. Well, in the monastery, temple monastery in India, there was a senior monk who asked me to go and we do various rituals with tulsi leaves, leaves from a sacred plant, sacred basil known as tulsi. So I had brought some tulsi leaves, but normally they're always cleaned very carefully, and
they were to be used for a particular ritual.
They were to be used for a particular ritual, a particular.
So you were just kind of given the job to go and collect them.
To go and collect them, yeah. And I brought them, and I hadn't washed them, and I'm not quite sure why. I guess thoughtlessness, or and so I presented them, and the priest asked if I'd washed them, and they were still because in the early morning there's dew on the leaves. So I simply said yes, and I don't even know what led me to say an untruth. I guess it was a combination of embarrassment and.
You were in front of a crowd of people at the time, right?
There were others there as well, yes. Okay. But when someone practices truth, they recognize untruth immediately. And the priest immediately knew that they had not been washed. Right. And he, very kindly, he said to me, well, go and wash them a second time.
That touched me also, because that seems to be a perfect, a very nice example of nonviolence there, right? Where it's like he could have embarrassed you, he could have, but the way that he said, well, then please wash him another time.
he could have berated me in public for sure.
Yeah, sure. He had, in one sense, he had the license to at that point, right? Yeah. And so that I saw that as an example of like how easily, or even thoughtless, without thought, we can be dishonest. Just even on something that has apparently little consequence. I mean, I love the way that you shared that story, because you said in that moment you became horrified with yourself, like, what am I doing? Or, but for me, that example kind of drew my mind to that need to examine, do I lie? How easily do I lie? What are the consequences of my being untruthful? So please share a little bit about this first item of the Dharma Code.
Well, one, maybe the most difficult untruth to even recognize are the various untruths we tell ourselves. And if we are believing the various lies we may tell ourselves, then automatically, as a result of that, we're also untruthful towards others. But one aspect of truth that I like to focus on is, if we're looking at truth as a thread, it's a very long thread. And what I love very much about Wisdom of the Sages is that it's very much based on truth. It's all about the deepest truths, the truths that lie concealed beneath the surface of reality. So that's Wisdom of the Sages is very much centered around that principle. But one aspect of truth that I like to focus on very much is being true to our nature, because there are so many, there's so much in our society that there are pressures to not be true to who we are as a person. So the text of India explained that we each have a particular individual nature, and we're not all built or constructed in the same way. And we have in our society various ideas of what it means to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead us to not live a life in accord with who we are. So there's one nurse named Bronnie Ware, and she's written a book not too long ago. She's a palliative nurse, and so she looks after patients who are in their final days. And she thought to herself, well, I'm not simply going to care for these patients as best as I can. Maybe I can also learn from them. Because awareness of our mortality can give us a particular perspective that is often lost in the hectic day-to-day endeavors of life.
Mm-hmm.
So she began asking her patients, what in your life went well? What in your life would you, well, if you could go back, what would you have done differently?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any regrets? And there was one regret that kept coming up again and again and again. The number one regret of dying patients was,
Yes.
I wish I'd had the courage to lead a life true to myself rather than the life that others expected of me.
Mm.
I wish I'd had the courage to lead a life true to my nature. And we find those same teachings in, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita, thousands of years earlier, where Krishna says to Arjuna, it's better to follow your nature, even if you make mistakes, than to follow another path, someone else's path, and do that perfectly. So we can have all the trappings of success, the symbols of status, or however we want to measure it, the car, the bank balance, the address, the postcode, however we want to measure it. If we're not living a life that's true to the nature we've been given in this life, we will always struggle. There'll always be an emptiness.
Yeah, it's obviously something important for us all to consider. And, you know, one thing about truth is it feels, I think to a lot of people, it feels like right now we're in a time and a place where, you know, people end up in very different polarized kind of positions of how they see the world. You know, there's that middle ground where, like, you know, in other words, like, what is a conservative, what is a liberal? Like, basically, if you know how someone sees one issue in life, you can more easily predict how they see every issue, because we're just, you know, we've gone to different ends of the spectrum. And getting back to your laws of perception, you know, so it seems like our ability for critical thought, our ability for clear perception may be compromised now, and really how we see the world is more than ever shaped by our being, our internal.
That's a great observation. Yeah.
And so, but there's such, you know, it seems like this kind of wisdom, this kind of contemplation, sharing these kind of thoughts is like the only way out. You know, it's like, you know, if we're going to uplift ourselves. And so therefore I appreciate books like yours. So that's something about truthfulness. And the next item on the Dharma Code is purity.
So I often say that in sharing the Dharma Code around the world, if anyone sometimes there's a resistance to the English translations. Mm-hmm. So for example, in some countries, purity, people tend to love that word. In other countries, maybe because it has particular associations, they might resist that word a little bit, or discipline sometimes has, for some people, it has particular connotations. Mm-hmm. So whenever that happens, I always say, well, think of the Sanskrit words, shocha or tapas. And so the Sanskrit for here is shocha. And really what it is about is the purity of what we consume. So we tend to be quite aware and increasingly so, of what we eat physically. So we want to have healthy or organic food. Those of us who are in the Bhakti tradition, we offer our food to God and it becomes sacred. So we think of those. We're quite careful with the food that we eat or or what we drink, but we're actually consuming through all of our senses. We're consuming through our eyes. We're drinking the world through our ears, and we may not pay so much attention to what we are consuming through our other senses. Even the mind, of course, where we focus our attention, we're bringing that into the world. And that's one of the laws of perception. We're drinking the world in that way. So purity, shaucha, is the ability to distinguish or discern between that which helps us and that which harms us.
That's how you conclude your chapter on that one. We can feel what degrades us. Likewise, we can feel what uplifts us or ennobles us. The sensitivity to make that distinction and the ability to act on it,
right,
is what the rishis called purity. It's really very helpful. But you also, it seems like, in one sense, your Dharma Code, you mentioned, it helps us reach. It's a way of living a life in integrity, and with an internal integrity and with a integrity with the laws of nature, or with these principles that are operating in nature. And so, and through that, we can achieve our full potential. But when we hear that kind of talk, it can sound like, and because often when we, self-help books will say, in your full potential, if you want to make money, go out there and make money. Maybe that's true, on that level, but you indicate a deeper level here still too. And one thing that you mentioned, again, in that chapter, was purity means to make our heart a sacred place so that Vishnu may reside there. Right? And I assume that's how you saw purity being practiced amongst them, understood and practiced amongst the monks that you lived with.
Yes, definitely. So one aspect of truth is we begin to see the world very differently as to what has value and what has less value. One aspect of truth is we begin to understand the ephemeral nature of this world and how the accumulation of wealth, or what we might at one stage in our life consider to be very important, over time, through the practice of truth, we come to see that these things are in many ways very trivial. It's so interesting how we come into this world naked, without anything. And we will leave this world without anything. There's nothing that we amass in the course of our life that we can take with us. So somehow, in between our naked birth and our naked death, we begin accumulating things and thinking in terms of, this is mine. And we adopt the perspective of competition and struggle in this world. So one aspect of truth, and here we are actually entering into the truths of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Yeah. One aspect of truth is, and these are the highest aspects of truth, that this life is not meant for that. There's a far greater wealth to be had. And that wealth is the wealth of the sages, the wisdom of the sages.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else before we move on? We only have an hour or so, maybe a little over an hour to discuss. So we've discussed a bit about truth and purity. Anything about purity you would like to share before we move on?
I would love to tell a story, but I don't think we have time.
Why not? We can always make a little extra time. If you've got a good story to tell, we'd love to hear it.
So this is a story. This is a true story from India, of a student named Surdas. Mm-hmm. And Surdas wanted to study the teachings of India, the teachings of the Upanishads, the teachings on the nature of the soul. And he went to his teacher, and he went to a teacher who was renowned for his wisdom, and asked to become his student. And the teacher said, practice purity, for 1 month and then come back. So Surdas went away and he began his meditation and his various rituals and practices of purity. And he came back a month later. And in India, often in towns and villages, there are these narrow alleyways, and you have street sweepers who clean the streets, and sometimes they have these like open gutters on the side.
Sure.
And as he was making his way past the street sweeper didn't really pay attention and flicked some dirt from his basket onto the pristine white clothes of Surdas.
Pure white clothes, right?
And
Yeah.
Surdas became very angry. He said, "Look what you've done. Now you just can't you pay attention? Now I have to go home and change. I'm supposed to be practicing purity." And so he went home, changed, and came back. Unbeknownst to him, his teacher had seen the incident and had seen him become so angry, and said, "You haven't mastered purity yet. Go and practice for another month." So Surdas went back and continued his practice, his rituals, daily rituals. And a month later, dressed in clean, fine clothes, he made his way down that same alleyway. And the street sweeper was there again. And this time, the street sweeper, as he turned, the broom, the brush made of they usually make them out of twigs for cleaning the sewers, he brushed that across the white kurta of Surdas. So it left like a streak of sewage across across the front. And Surdas became enraged, and he began yelling, "This time you've done this on purpose. I know you've done this on purpose. It cannot be by accident that this has happened twice." And he was literally, practically foaming from the mouth. He was so angry. And again, his teacher told him, "Go back and practice purity for another month." So a month later, he made his way down that same alleyway. This time, the sweeper spotted him in the distance and said, "Oh, I remember him. He berated me for no reason, for a simple mistake that I made. This time I'll teach him a lesson." So the sweeper went to an elevated place, took his whole basket and threw it over Surdas. And Surdas was dripping in dirt and filth. But the sweeper saw something that caught his attention, something quite remarkable, because the student was not angry. Instead, he folded his hands and he said to the sweeper, "I am very grateful to you because you have taught me how to overcome my own anger." And the teacher saw that as well. And the teacher was very pleased and said, "Now you have mastered, you've learned this principle of purity."
Yeah, it's so important. Another actually great example of how one's internal world shapes their external world, because he perceived that this person was doing it on purpose. And because he perceived that eventually he was doing it on purpose. But that's a beautiful story, and again, it kind of gives it's the sharing of this kind of story and the reflection of this kind of story. I find that kind of brings us from that, and nowadays a lot of times people frame it as like the difference between, say, like religion and spirituality. Like, in other words, taking it off that superficial platform. He was thinking pure means I'm wearing very pure clothes and externally appearing very pure. What purity really meant was the kind of tolerance and his mind was pure when it was free of the ego that was making him act in with such a clouded perception or such intolerance or such hatred, even anger. Yeah, thank you. So now we've talked about satyam, truth. We've talked about saucha, purity, and the next
ahimsa. Non-violence. So these four principles of dharma are for those for listeners who viewers who practice yoga, these are very important because they're two of the most important yamas and two of the most important niyamas. Mm-hmm. So satya and ahimsa are the first two yamas. And ahimsa is it's easier perhaps to understand ahimsa by looking at the various patterns of violence that we see in the world or we may experience in our own life. So we can be violent to others, we can be violent to ourselves, and we can be violent to the environment, to the earth. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, now we are beginning, after many decades, or maybe I should say centuries of violence to the earth, we're beginning, because we have to, we're beginning to pay more attention now to the violence, the exploitation of our environment. Violence to others, generally we try to be careful with that, although violence can take many forms that are also subtle. And in England, we are experts at various types of passive-aggressive behavior.
Okay.
So sometimes we can end up being violent to others without even being aware of it. So it's a constant, it requires constant awareness and reflection. But perhaps most difficult to recognize are the patterns of violence that we may inflict upon ourselves. And I therefore like to focus on that because we can be very aggressive towards ourselves. And that often happens when we take the story of our life very, very seriously. We take it too seriously. So we're all living out a particular story. We're the main character in our story. And much of the story of our life we've actually inherited. We've inherited from our family, from the media, from our friends. And we carry that story with us wherever we go. And we live our life from it. And it directs the course of our life. So in India, in ancient India, they were aware that the main character of our story is not actually who we are. So they have a special word for the main character of our story, and that is ahankara, the false sense of self, the particular main character that we create in the story of our life. So when we live from our story and we take it so seriously and forget that it's just a story, we begin to experience these three types of suffering: fear, lamentation, and confusion. These types of suffering associated with time. And we know when we take our story too seriously that we experience great drama in our life. And we're prepared even to fight for our stories, to lose friends over them, in defending our particular story. It's actually the starting point of the Gita, where Dhritarashtra is expressing his story, and he's expressing the conflict that arises from investing everything in this narrative that we create. So by understanding that we are not this character in our narrative, it releases a lot of suffering in our world. And it's a form of being kind to ourselves.
Beautiful. There's another point that you made in discussing nonviolence that I thought was really relevant, that had to do with we might try to walk around trying to be nonviolent, but maybe a more effective way about to do that is to, like, because being nonviolent is one sense like a negative thing in the sense of like what I'm not going to do, but that how we can really achieve that through what we do,
right? And
in which you defined really as giving, right? And so I thought I would share this. I thought you expressed it so nice. You discussed the type of isolation that we tend to commonly feel. I think people very commonly feel a sense of isolation in this world. And so you said, you said, when we try to make all things serve us, we find ourselves utterly alone. Overcoming our separateness, leaving the prison of our aloneness, is our deepest need as human beings. We overcome our isolation when we live for others rather than for ourselves. And that relates to nonviolence in the sense that
Nonviolence is like a starting point. It's simply the gateway for this particular principle of Dharma. Really, this principle is about love and affection for all beings. And when we in the Bhakti tradition, when we offer our love to the supreme center, the soul of the universe, automatically we develop affection for all beings. There's a place in our heart for everyone. Everyone is family. So that is such an important teaching in the sacred texts of India. And ahimsa, non-violence, is simply a starting point.
I see.
Daya is even, so in the Srimad Bhagavatam, these four principles of Dharma, here the word daya is actually used. So daya is not, ahimsa is about avoiding violence or aggression to others. Daya is even the next step. Daya is about actively trying to reduce the suffering of others.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, thank you. So now we've got these three: truthfulness, purity, and nonviolence, and then the fourth of the Dharma Code to wrap it up on, to complete the Dharma Code.
So the fourth principle is tapas. Tapas actually it means heat. Mm-hmm. So if if I'm cooking anything, rice, or let's say kheer, I'm making a sweet rice, which is a famous dish in India. So I can have all of my ingredients. I can have the best basmati rice. I can have cardamom seeds. I can have my pots and pans. I can have a jaggery and saffron, everything. If there's one particular element that I need, if I don't have that, I can't do anything, and that's heat. So with the principles of Dharma, unless we actually have the discipline to bring them into action, they just remain good ideas. They remain on the level of intellectual thought. So this principle of tapas, or discipline, is fundamental, because what it does is it brings to life the principles of Dharma. Now, what's important, of course...
So if I just understand that right, so in other words, truthfulness, purity, ahimsa, these are great, but if they just remain concepts, they're not going to transform my life. There's going to need to be some discipline to apply them.
Right.
That's going to make them all come alive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And in one sense, I see that often our attempts, or our I'll speak for myself, my study of the ancient texts of India, it is very limited unless I'm actually daily trying to make efforts to bring it into my own practice. And even the smallest living in a small way, some of these teachings has a huge effect. Whilst otherwise we can think about them and contemplate them for many years, but the effect of that will be limited. Actually, the effect of that will not really, there will not really be any real effect unless we're actually putting them into practice, and it's making a difference in the way that we think, speak, and live in everyday life.
Well, so many of our listeners, they don't have the opportunity that you had as a young man to live in an ashram in India with people that were deeply immersed in this culture and in these principles. How do you see that discipline practically? How could that discipline, may it take root in their life, or how do you see them practicing these?
I actually believe that those of us who are not in a monastery or in a sacred sanctuary, for instance, we're in a privileged place to apply these principles.
Okay.
Because it's easier to apply them in a monastery. It's easier, or it can be easier. It's very difficult to apply these in the chaotic, frenetic energy of everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So in relation to the Gita, for instance, the setting of that is a battlefield, and life can feel very much like a battlefield. Unexpected changes in fortunes, chaotic, frenetic. So it's actually a perfect place for applying these principles of Dharma. Personally, I try to apply them in two different ways. One of them is through decision making. So if I have a decision to make that is really going to affect my own life in a big way, or the lives of others around me, I will take the time to consider carefully whether the decision, the option I want to take is aligned with truth, whether it's aligned with purity, non-violence, and discipline. So I use it as a tool for reflection. Mm-hmm. But having said that, it's difficult to apply the Dharma Code in that way for every little decision that we make in life. It becomes difficult to do that. It's not practical. So here comes the second way to apply it, which is even more effective. And that is to develop each of these principles individually. They're like a muscle. So we have the muscle of truth, the muscle of nonviolence, the muscle of discipline. And there are various ways, practices in our everyday life that can help us build that and strengthen it to the extent, hopefully, that we begin living these principles naturally. Mm-hmm. So the rishis or the kings, the philosopher kings like Yudhishthira, they would, just by their nature, they would live out, they would embody and live these principles of Dharma. So an example of how we might be able to practice or to develop the muscle of discipline, for example, in Lithuania not too long ago, I did a workshop on the Dharma Code, and there was one young man, really quite brilliant. He came up to me later and he explained that he has many different ideas that his friends and colleagues tell him are really quite brilliant, and he's a very creative person. But he said to me that he finds it very difficult to apply them in his, like, to do anything with them. So he'll have these ideas and he'll mull them over, he'll discuss them with others, he'll even make some plans, but then they won't translate into action for some reason. Or he'll start to, but it'll fail, and he'll move on to something else. So it became quite clear that in our discussion that there was a lack of, like, a shortage of discipline. That was an area that he could perhaps work on. So we discussed ways in which he might be able to do that, and I suggested to him that that if he were to wake up early and make that part of his practice. He explained that he wakes up normally at like 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and he likes to work late. So we discussed the possibility of making it part of his everyday life as a small change, which can be a difficult change if one is not accustomed to it. Waking up early, maybe at 5 a.m. And he began doing that. And it was like what's sometimes called a trim tab change, a small change in his life that had a very great result. So his very first step into the day was a practice of discipline. Mm-hmm. And that discipline then carried throughout his day and became like a governing principle or an active design principle in his life. And he contacted me later and said that really worked for him. It was a small change in his life that had a big impact. So each of these 4 principles, we can see which ones we might be a little bit weak in, or we might want to improve. And there are various practices we can do that can help us strengthen them.
As you travel the world and give your talks and people read your books, do you get a lot of stories coming back from people who've applied the Dharma Code in their lives and get interesting results?
There have been some incredible stories.
Maybe share one or two.
Stories. There's one. Well, the Book of Dharma has made its way to prisons in the U.S. and so sometimes I get letters from people in very difficult positions who are making incredible changes in their life as a result. Mm-hmm. But one particular change that really touched my heart from someone. A business person in the UK who wrote to me and said that he was running abattoirs. He had that was his how he made his livelihood. He was running abattoirs. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what that.
Where you slaughterhouses.
Oh, okay, all right.
And after reading the Book of Dharma and reflecting on it and beginning to practice it, because it's really in trying to practice these principles, we begin to see how important they are, and they take on great significance in our life. He has closed down his slaughterhouses as a result of that. And one thing that he mentioned, which is quite incredible, and it aligns with my own experience, that when we live in accord with these principles of life, the universe looks after us. So when we apply truth in our life, then things change in our life in a way to support us. So although this particular person had turned his back on a livelihood characterized by violence and was entering into an uncertain world, for him, things worked in such a way that he was looked after. And that's been my personal experience as well.
There's one Sanskrit aphorism or something. Is it Dharma Rakshati something or other? Do you know that one?
Yes. Those who protect Dharma, Dharma protects them.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. And when we live a life against Dharma, then it leads to our own destruction.
But what, I never understood it quite. It kind of sunk in for me just right now, maybe more than it had before. But the idea that, okay, living this, in one sense, let's say, and we're just skimming the surface of this book right now. We're just kind of quickly jumping through the different topics that are covered. If you read the book itself, it's going to go much deeper into each one of these. And one might read that and say, this makes perfect sense to me. I love the message. I realize I do need to look within and live a life of integrity, and that these principles of truthfulness and purity and etc. Could be very valuable and would make my life, rather than just like be drawn down the course of life the way that we are, and each day ticking away and nothing meaningful or deeply transformative taking place. If I focused on this, my life could open up in whole new ways and really become deeply spiritual and deeply satisfying and deeply, a gift to myself and a gift to the world. But at the same time, what's going to happen is we're going to face, when it comes time to live that principle, it's going to be challenging, and we'll look at it and say, well, I'm going to have to sacrifice for that, and in this case, this person, their livelihood, it seemed like, well, I'm going to have to sacrifice my livelihood. I've been making money this way. That's the kind of choice that becomes really, that can become very difficult to make, where these lofty principles hit reality, and we have to decide, am I willing to make a change? And if at that time, we can reflect on this idea That how did you phrase it again? That one who protects Dharma?
Dharma protects them.
Dharma protects
Yeah.
them. So in other words, let me right now, we can say protect, but you could phrase it differently, like one who lives Dharma, their life is maintained by Dharma, or something like that. Right now, let me trust in this principle. For those with faith, they understand that Dharma, is all, ultimately there's God behind that Dharma. It's not just a law, but there's a lawmaker behind it, that has a heart and that cares and so on. But if I take this risk in my life, and it appears, challenging, and it appears that I may not be maintained if I take this risk, that actually it's right there. It's kind of right there where the big transformation takes place, where let me have that faith, even if it is risky, and then see how Dharma protects one, or how Dharma maintains one. And that's where the faith gets really deep and strong, and that transformation takes place. I love it. Maybe just one last question as we're running out of time, but do you see any ways where, like, this, again, very ancient teachings for kings and queens is particularly relevant in our modern day, and in our lives in this era, this century, even this decade?
We most certainly we need this wisdom more than ever. Interestingly, we call ourselves as a species, we call ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens. So sapiens means wise. So we're humans. We're calling ourselves extremely wise humans.
Okay.
But if we look at if we look at where we are with the destruction of the world, the depletion of natural resources, the conflict that we're faced with on so many levels, and the cruelty to animals and so on, it's very difficult to reach any conclusion other than the one that Homo sapiens sapiens is what we're still aspiring to be.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom is something that remains an aspiration. And so at this particular time, this wisdom is what is most needed collectively, but also in our individual lives.
Well, I appreciate you're doing so much to help that with your teachings and with your books. Again, we've been discussing the Book of Dharma today. There's another excellent book out there, Yoga in the Dark Night of the Soul. Where's the best place for people to find these? Do you have a website yourself?
I do, simonhaas.com.
simonhaas.com.
These books are available.
Haas is H-A-S-S, Haas?
H-A-A-S.
H-A-A-S.
H-A-A-S. And you can find these books also on various platforms like Amazon and Audible and so on.
Okay, so they're out there. Well, Simon, thank you so much. Since I met you, I've been wanting to have you come and be part of the show, and I know you're very busy. You know, I didn't even mention that you actually run a law firm, right? You run a law firm. You're doing a PhD, and still you write books and you teach. So you must have mastered that discipline one. I'm still working on that myself.
I'm still working on it too.
Okay.
Kaustubha, thank you for inviting me on this show. It's really such an honor. And yeah, I'm a big admirer of you and Raghunath and the work that you do.
Well, I just want to say likewise. Since I've met you, I've really developed a deep appreciation for you and all that you have to say on so many different subject matters. And your scholarship, the way that you live, the way that you teach, I think is really wonderful. And so it's been a pleasure having you on. And we'll have to bring you back, and we'll talk about the Yoga of the Dark Night of the Soul sometime in the future. Does that sound okay? I
would love it.
Okay, thank you so much. And now this is the part of our show that we call the dance cam. Everybody needs every morning to do a little dance and hear a little kirtan. It was funny. I was mentioning it was a week ago, I did a talk for a seminary, online like this. and they took a break and they played music and they all started dancing. I thought that we were the only ones that did that, but there are other people out there that play music and dance. So here we go. Mara, who we got dancing today?